Asking for It, a Novel Approach. Episode 17. Coda to Book 1. The raw marble piazza glows in the light of new day. Pygmalion, an impoverished sculptor, crosses diagonally, leaving the deep shadow in Water-Drawer's passage behind. Out across the open square he hastens, a solitary cur pacing him along one row of the bordering house fronts. In the square's far corner stands the newly consecrated Ring of the Naiads. The water spirits dance their serpentine way, ever back one upon the other. Pygmalion cannot avoid them without taking a wide detour, the time for which he can ill afford. He needs to arrive home before the landlady rises to mount her guard at his closet studio's narrow shared entryway. But first, guarding his exit from the piazza are his celebrated nemeses, Grazia's finely wrought naiads. He hardly glances at the figures as he passes. Already he has lost too many hours in rapt, if grudging, admiration. The lost commission and the prestige attached still rankle. The rewards for his own work he carries with him in the knotted muscle of his forearms, his boot-leather palms, and the calluses armoring his digits. Off the piazza, out of view and back into the shadows, his mind dark with envy, heart heavy with forebodings, Pygmalion falls to his knees on the cobbled Via Destino. He implores the gods, head thrown back to the sliver of sky between rooftops nearly meeting above him. If he could only bring life to stone, such as these wonders wrought by Grazia, his love and life could be celebrated too. In his humble chambers that very night, awaiting his return, the miracle of his cherished favorite smiles upon him. So long, so close to the perfection of his art, the alabaster girl stirs. Senses reeling, clinging to the door frame, Pygmalion is overthrown. By the gods with life infused, she parts her peerless lips. Grazia muse, Jupiter dispatch. An oracle? Frozen in the doorway, years of sacrifice and penury melt away from him. Pygmalion boggles in the liminal space to which he has arrived. The hours that follow hold such ecstasy their import defies reckoning. In Grazia's spacious studio next day, hammer blows ring out rhythmically. Pygmalion edges closer to the great sheet of muslin, hung rafters to floor against the dust. Peering around the flimsy drape, his eyes report trickery. The work is majestic. It is monumental, but the writhing mass of Neptune's watery beard, focus of the chisel's present gouging, is not what amazes. The great god of the sea lies prone on the vast studio floor. A grimace of immortal life confounded squeezes shut his eyes, draws the lips back in a sneer. Yet even this blasphemy, the god's evident demise, is but a minor distraction. The wonder is in the woman's arm flexing for each blow, a woman's body straining behind the thick leather apron. Her smooth complexion is furrowed with concentration and beaded with sweat at the brow. Hammer meets chisel steadily and true. Does Grazia beard a sculptress? Can a woman have created the sublime naiads, cause of his too frequent despair? Pygmalion's mind flounders in turmoil. Impossible ruse! Should he disclose it, heavy the implications for his art. Not yet a day since the gods answered his prayer, revelation in his own creation claiming breath. Now this? motionless. He clings to the drapery's edge, prey to the gaze the sculptress turns upon him. He is drawn, irresistibly, uncomprehending cause, uncomprehending the wonder before him. Compelled, he stumbles to where the sculptress perches astride the fallen god's neck. She holds Pygmalion's eyes, lets her tools rest, patiently observes his approach. At the last, he is on his knees, dust on the floor, the hem of her tunic over one sandaled foot, the whole of his world. With her hammer, the sculptress lifts his chin. Pygmalion looks up. With chisel, she traces the hollow in his cheek. Despite the wonder, with envy he burns. Grazia enwomaned! And I, a mere thing of jealousy, he thinks. Less than that, her eyes reply. Her eyes caress, engraving him with the same sure commands her chisel exacts of stone. Pygmalion apprehends the nearest edge of divinity. Directly, his conscious thoughts crystallize in tabula rasa, smooth as polished stone. Pygmalion the sculptor, a minor nobleman, becomes kneeling supplicant, a minor work in stone, one among many huddled beneath shelving against the cavernous studio's rear wall. And so begins Asking for It, a novel approach, Book 2. Yours to Lose. Chapter 69. Lance Alberti is on hold. Wendy, the perky telereceptionist at DB Pleasure Products, put him on hold with an inappropriately perky, "Hang in there." He's looked everywhere, beginning with the little bedside drawer where Michaela claimed to have left both keys. With the edge, Michaela is now winging her way west, business class to LAX, Lance's own parting gift. "Sorry about that. So, Lance, I've got some good news. It looks like you live in a good neighborhood. If both keys are actually lost, a professional locksmith is your best option. A good one should be able to crack our little DB no problem. Now, they might say they require authorization, but no problem. That's what we're here for. If they can't do something like that over the phone, what can they do, right?" For the duration of Wendy's breathless progress report, Lance slumps to one side, sapped of belief. The chair beneath him seems to be subsiding steeply to his right. The morning sun penetrating the cafe's slightly greasy front window is painful. "Lance? Mr. Alberti? Still there?" Yes. "Would you like us to contact a locksmith on your behalf?" "No problem. It's what we're here for." Lance surges upright again. His existential turbulence suddenly has abated. He hasn't really heard what Wendy's parting pleasantries were. He'll just wear the damn thing, at least until a more dignified solution can be arranged. He supposes there are people, women perhaps, who would consider it fair and appropriate that he wear it. Not as a joke either, more a symbol of his making amends for men's collective affront to women. He ponders causes for contemporary man's disturbingly poor reputation. Not that he can accept the usual. Men are shallow and inadequate matches for the emotionally sophisticated wonder that is woman. He ponders the very existence of penile chastity devices. One way and another, he supposes he has, and is, earning his own personal ignominy. Men in general just have a branding problem. His adult life long, men have been poor performers in the joint venture of man-woman relations. If they're not bullies, they're losers. If neither, then most likely liars and or cheats. The accusations fly, and the only men defending themselves are not the ones who will improve matters. The reactionary and overcompensating doofus rises to the radical feminist's bait as if determined to prove her right. The more confident, the better balanced the individual male, the less likely he is to enter the debate at all. His general attitude and behavior may be perfectly reasonable. It is a moot point. He may be confident in his moral rectitude. He may even be exactly right in this. This ideal man will still bear the stigma. No doubt about it. The whole man brand is in trouble. Chapter 70. At a point early in his 37th year, Manfred Meekness, one acclaimed novel and a string of writers' residencies behind him, toyed with a ruined spoon on his kitchen table. He inspected it from its own level. His right cheek had been pasted to the table's sticky surface for how long had it been? Closing his left eye with his right, he squinted while tilting the spoon slightly. He looked on as the spoon's bottom, blackened with pitch, grew up and out from the tabletop. It became a monstrous black oblong, eclipsing the bright window and everything in the world beyond. Closing his right eye and using the left instead, he appraised the caramelized brown glaze in the spoon's concavity. Heroin had always appealed to him on a purely aesthetic level. The rush and fleeting elation were seductive as well. The monolithic assurance that nothing else in the world mattered comforted him, even as it reduced and simplified life. His ennui, however profound, remained stubbornly inadequate to this pursuit of his own destruction. His present fugue was mere dalliance. He'd better simply accept it as such. On his kitchen wall hung an institutional clock salvaged from some decommissioned elementary school. The clock had a round, white face, ringed around with chrome that was corroding. The orderly array of black dashes and digits on the face intimidated. The circling of the hands was dizzying. Manfred looked back to the spoon. Was it too soon to cook up another shot? Or too late, perhaps? He knew this was all ridiculous. He was a dilettante. Unsure how best to trouble his existence, he'd floundered. Willing himself back into the writing harness, he'd been daunted by the innumerable furrows confronting him. Where could he plow back in? He needed his creative life to groove again. For that he needed to suffer something more than boredom and solitude. As an angsty teen, he'd idealized the tortured genius, creative spirit. 37 years old, for God's sake. Time was wasting. He had to write, whatever else it might entail. It was 3 weeks since he'd heard through the grapevine that Ruth Ann had left her little apartment in the sunset. 3 months and 3 weeks since she'd graciously ceded him that Venice space. He was only a little surprised she'd moved on without final words. After another month, a letter arrived. October 10th, 1980. You of East Anglia, the Fens. Meekness, sorry to start right in with your nemesis, the ellipsis, but I'm challenged coming up with a more convenient segue to this relation of my new reality. With its virtual disappearance from my life, convenience is something I've grown newly fond of. Apologies again, the ghastly dangling preposition. When I moved out, going back to school was not top of mind, much less doing English lit in this unglamorous corner of the United Kingdom, as we call it here. It's proving, well, interesting. I couldn't face full-time campus life, and so I've taken a tiny cottage sublet, miles out on a green continuum of flat and low land, predominantly populated by endless hectares of potatoes and cauliflower. I ride an ancient black bicycle, the better part of an hour to and from the school. In the evenings I burn peat to warn off the dank clutches of night on the fens. A last bit of local color for you. Outdoors, I wear tall rubber boots and bulky woolen sweaters. I have two, one gray, the other army drab. Inside, it's street shoes and said woolen sweaters all over again. I miss the glamour of L.A., like I miss the cheap conveniences of life there. A little, not a lot. You are another story. You may or may not like to know. Anyway, just wanted to check in since I left somewhat spontaneously. All but forgotten graduate program application, resulting acceptance and entry notwithstanding. Hope you're writing well. Ruth Ann. She wrote 3 more short letters over the ensuing academic year. Long and pained silences preceded each of Manfred's emotionally guarded, uncharacteristically curt replies. The Manfred meekness Ruth Ann had known was a fascinating half-breed, equal parts cognoscente and social gamine. He strode across the campus, mind abuzz, all but blind to his surroundings. He pranced from cafe to booze can with a debutante's abandon. She'd found him irresistible, articulate and prematurely sophisticated, as limber as she was statuesque. Ruth Ann smote meekness every bit as mortally. For approximately 6 months. Inexplicable to Ruth Ann, they went from red-hot lovers to utter estrangement in the weeks before she'd moved out of their delightfully cramped Venice apartment. She was 21 years old, suddenly going on 35. Strangely, the success Meekness had experienced early in his writing life made him wary. Contentment crept up upon him from time to time. Then he'd startle awake like a sleepwalker, suddenly conscious of a precipice, arrived at in midnight wandering. He was a firm believer in the athlete's adage, no pain, no gain. The wordsmith's variant referred as much to a life's emotional turmoil as to the grueling endurance required to remain glued in one seat long enough to wring revelations from the written word. Sensing sloth approaching in the guise of contentment, Meekness threw himself under the first bus he could find. That bus was Ruth Ann Danzig. 6 feet to his 5'5", aesthetically as close to perfection as Meekness was remote from it. She intimidated him like some agent of impending ruin. Anticipating painful rejection, Manfred's mortification was undermined as she actually responded to his false bravado. Against any kind of reason, she met his swaggering parody of self-possession with a complimentary, however unlikely, deference. Warily, he accepted the flattery. Ruth Ann, like most who'd read him, found his evident insight and writerly love of humanity eminently attractive. The close reader revered that love in his lines, and Ruth Ann Danzig was a close reader. Within a week, he'd warmed to the idea she could be genuinely interested. She could already make out the warm and genuine smile behind his misshapen, snaggle-toothed grin. To universal amazement, they became a couple. The Norse goddess and the potent homunculus of UCLA's writing program. For 6 months, she honey-dipped the cynical barbs that made Meekness often unpopular among the upbeats, the hipster set he drank with. It was the mid-'70s. These literate post-hippies reclaimed the vinegar of the Beat's social critique, but decanted it in academically faceted, often party-colored conversation. All fine with Ruth Ann. Less fine was their increasingly frequent miring in the convolutions of postmodern theoretical discourse. By God, she tired easily of that self-indulgence, the seemingly pointless verbal gymnastics. A lot of this postmodern rap had to do with deconstruction, deconstructing authority, fixed meanings, authorial intent, and inverting hierarchies of all sorts, the patriarchy in particular. All well and good that far, with alcohol for lubricant. Unfortunately, the talk bled into the writing, and there Ruth Ann felt an obligation to draw a line. On her side of that line was Manfred Meekness. On the other was a lot of abstract, in her opinion, pretty dull reading. A dutiful academic of his times, Meekness could wax postmodern between lusty gulps of cheap brandy at the bar. But at his desk, he let his written subjects roam free of contemporary theories. True, his heroines usually had better radar than their male counterparts. They often bent bad situations to their will, but their lives were never shorn of ambiguities. These women did not prove theses. Meekness left politics to the critics. His women could be chauvinists, his men feminists, their appearances sometimes morphing by story's end. Of course, story itself drew heavy postmodern fire, and there Ruth Ann drew her line anew. Humans are storytellers, plain and simple. Of course, timely stories are dressed in the day's favored forms, inevitably evolved from all that have preceded. But please, truncated narrative? That is just casualty. And a whole pack of them, situated in parallel, in sequence, or any other way you like, they will not likely constitute successful narrative. Ditto the tales with many ends, or those of conflicting origins. However intentional the effects, these texts always left Ruth Ann doubting the author's capacity to make coherent art from life's infinite store of materials. Maybe they just knew what they did not like and had yet to hit on something brilliant in its stead. Throwing out baby with the bathwater syndrome. The Meekness text, by contrast, the actual material of his writing, down to its very phonemes, reflected the vast and various scope of his subjects, almost invariably. When it did not, it was because he had chosen to tell an incisive, undecorated tale, the impact of which could be yet more visceral. For his part, Meekness engaged his contemporaries, those arbitrary multipliers of meaning and inverters of tradition, with a knowing acceptance of their weakness. As far as he was concerned, the war on binaries seemed a bit rich. Anyone with common sense, let alone a graduate degree, could tell you that art, like life itself, is anything but black and white. All this said, Manfred Meekness had his own obsessions. They concerned the saltier aspects of human behavior. It was these he elaborated in his writing. Best job for the best tool, the way Ruth Ann looked at it. Meekness was just not meta, as they'd begun saying at that time. He did not oblige reading about writing. Though only 21, Ruth Ann's height and sober sense of fashion meant she was easily mistaken for an adjunct professor. She had a more than precocious wit. Her reading life had been broad and adventurous. Most importantly, she had the irrepressible urge to raise the caliber of any conversation she joined. As a dissenter from the literary wisdom du jour, Manfred often alienated his contemporaries. Ruth Ann enthusiastically beat paths back onto common ground for him. Circling the wagons, she liked to call it. After brandy number 2 at the evening's bar of choice, Manfred could be crude, more like a circle jerk to my mind. But he loved her for her suffering the fools that he could not. In truth, these were not fools, only they insisted on using the finer tools of language to belabor the sedimentary rock of academic thought. Worse, worn out from the labor, they take out their frustrations on the novel, for example. Manfred Meekness deigned to refute them only so long. By midnight, stationed back at his typewriter, he gave critical theory no further thought, much less voice. Ruth Ann Danzig had manifested in Manfred's life with mythic force, a Venus surfing into the port of Los Angeles. Some well-meaning students had cajoled Meekness into a trip to the beach. Not a common occurrence in Manfred's life. He sweltered as his friends mulled over various rock lyricists' literary insouciance, shading his gaze from the California sun, sweating in his black denim shirt and jeans. He was incongruous among the tanned and half-naked Angelinos populating the white sand strand. On campus, dressed demurely in blouses and blue jeans, Ruth Ann irked the popular girls, the far-out fashion plates and their entourages. Among faculty and students alike, her statuesque bearing inspired as many hackneyed verses as it did well-turned pickup lines. When she materialized on the foaming surf that day, wet hair tangled about her shoulders, her lithe, bikinied physique a seductive advertisement for the Golden State itself, no one in Manfred's little group recognized her. When she approached and addressed the squinting Meekness, all were equally taken aback. She uttered but 3 innocuous words of greeting. These, however, engendered a resounding silence. When she continued up the beach, there was a chorus of, "Was that? Isn't she in?" and similar attempts to reckon the apparition. Meekness remained silent, staring without focus into her wake, hearing only the crashing waves that disgorged her. For the next following weeks, Meekness wandered in the sensual garden that was Ruth Ann Danzig. He reveled in the rigor of her mind. The English romantic John Keats suggested the power of a poet's craft could be expressed in the term negative capability. Meekness was perhaps a true adherent, prizing openness to the experience of mystery high above even its most sophisticated taxonomy. Yet, Ruth Ann was more than mere mystery. For him, she embodied infinite capability. He could believe her almost literally capable of anything. Midway through their ensuing 6 months of raptures, she remained an unfailing source of wonder, a heady lesson in the comprehension of beauty. When, for a day or more, he'd not drunk his habitual deep draught of her, Ruth Ann never hesitated to refill his glass in a way he would remember. Gradually, however, Manfred's ardor took a back seat to his wonder. Ruth Ann, he reasoned, was simply too perfect to be sullied with common carnal mauling. He grew reticent, succumbing to girl-on-a-pedestal syndrome. His perceptive paramour hit on a novel solution to this ebbing of his passion. She chose one of Manfred's favorite albums, Puccio and his Latin Soul Brothers, slid it onto the record player one day, then stalked into Manfred's peripheral vision as he sat fruitlessly poking at his typewriter. The sinuous rhythm and blues lament accompanied her progress across the room. "Well, I need you, I can't take your fooling around, I got my big stick." It was an ancient, grit-and-whiskey bluesman vocal. Sunlight descended steeply through the room's one small window, hit the floor, and spread out in a glaucous puddle there. Ruth Ann wore her most faithful faded jeans, and nothing more. The mellow light on her shoulders, breasts, and belly glowed as she moved to the deep and soulful groove. She put a subtle, mincing grind into her step, a subtle dip and twist of her hips to the rhythm. Keep on jiving and I'll knock you to the ground with my big stick. Seemingly, from thin air she'd produced a long, translucent purple dildo. Crossing the room, slowly closing the gap between them, she slapped the festive penis into the palm of her free hand. Staring down the mesmerized writer, mouthing the lyric meaningfully, she stopped only when Manfred's nose was snug in the harbor of her navel. Only then the mischievous reproach in her eyes softened. Manfred, unmanned, had begun squirming with need. The purple phallus fell to the floor, and the final 3 months of their tryst proceeded without another amorous glitch. In the end, Manfred made a terrible winner, second-guessing away his uncommon good fortune. Ruth Ann's loving and had drugged him. He couldn't expect to stay high on her forever. Even if one person could fulfill all of another's emotional needs, it was the 70s, for God's sake. To keep his writing alive, he rationalized hard, convincing himself he needed drama more than love. Directly, he felt unworthiness overtaking him. He'd forsaken his muse. Single for 6 weeks and counting, Meekness bleakly pondered his folly, toying with the blackened spoon. How had he made such a monumental, such a senseless sacrifice? How could he throw the young goddess's love back in her face? He'd made his excuses, cited her youthful promise and his own incommensurate gifts. He was leaving her, sparing her, he said, his own dubious mental health. He'd struggled not to sound disingenuous, and in the wake of Ruth Ann's quiet departure, he could now claim, all too plausibly, the very infirmity that he'd affected. Miserable, he made an earnest pact with himself to resist all future inclinations to writerly self-help. Chapter 71. Dusk has displaced the brighter colors of sunset in the sky outside the big picture window. Los Angeles is lost in particulate matter somewhere 2 canyons distant and a few 100 feet below. In the last of the natural light, a towering orchid on the tall glass table changes its hues. All around its base are littered lines of cocaine, and the dusty remains of former lines. Michaela holds the edges gaze across the tabletop. Armand, the first name on Lance's list of contacts, is sitting at one end of the table. Then he's standing and pacing across the heated faux adobe floor, back to the modernist red steel fireplace, and back again to sit again and gaze skittishly at Michaela. So, stunt work, you say? Sure about that? 'Cause, you're pretty good looking for stunts. A lot of people gonna get confused. Line? Are you sure? Even given her one-word replies, this conversation, the second of its kind since they'd arrived, seems to last an eternity. The Edge is as usual perfectly reconciled to hearing out this supposed expert, with his supposed interest in their careers. God, his equanimity is unhelpful. You'd think he's got all his lifetime and yours to spend on a given problem. So, here's the deal. I'm a film producer. I don't really do talent, if you know what I mean. I mean talent, not really my specialty. So, line? You're sure? Michaela is getting more than a little ticked off with the lack of progress here. She's asking for a job, not a presidential nomination. She's not after this guy's life and death endorsement. Can't anyone get that she's just not looking for a handout? She's only asking for what she can earn. Her life is so whack these days. She's got one guy locked in Chastity on the other side of the country, the Edge still not taking yes for an answer, hiding his pecker away, the proverbial friend and protector, and still no job. So, line? Sure? Jesus. Okay, what the fuck? Give me one. The Edge raises his eyebrows fractionally at this, but says nothing. Michaela was hoping for more of a reaction. She takes the little silver tube the producer offers. The ornately etched antique silver puts her in mind of her grandmother's cameo and crucifix. She sighs inwardly before dipping her face over the table and inhaling the coke. Oh, brother, she thinks, and exhales. Yeah, like this is what I need. It's not her very first line. She's from Florida, after all. But it's bigger and so much better than anything her low-rent friends ever talked her into. She closes her eyes a moment, noting an uprush of fresh mountain air. A not-so-subtle pleasure establishes itself somewhere at her brainstem. Thankfully, her heart's little tap dance only lasts for a few seconds. She fixes the Edge with a, "There, are you satisfied?" expression. But he's refusing to judge her, and strangely, that's just fine. So, yeah, definitely stunts. I've got drama in my life as it is. Does this even make sense? Most people would not dedicate themselves to a professional life sure to be punctuated with numerous physical injuries, some potentially crippling maybe. But I can do it. Easy. Better the devil you know. Obviously, I could also flaunt my ass for all the world to see. Why not do both? Hell, I'm young and strong, and I turn heads as well. The world's my oyster. This is why people do this stuff. I've got all night, all the rest of my life. I can talk the world into seeing things my way. The producer is looking straight at her, smiling his handsome Mediterranean smile and nodding his head. The Edge is nodding along as well. Oh, God, has she just said some of that shit out loud? Edgy, she thinks, you should maybe just run, because I'm picking up speed, and fast.